If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine. And maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them. From disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18 plus.
Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome to another episode in our debut Spotlight series, where we shine the light on the freshest authors and their work. Today, the spotlight is on author Dani Heywood-Lonsdale and her novel The Portrait Artist. The Portrait Artist is a historical debut set between London and Oxford. One morning in 1890, a painting appears on the steps of the National Gallery. The painting is unmistakably the work of Timothy Pondon Hall, an artist thought to be dead for 50 years. The gallery enlists renowned art historian Solomon Oake to investigate, and joining him is his daughter Alice, a passionate and ambitious student. As the two of them delve into Pondon Hall's legacy, they uncover secrets they had never expected. Dani Heywood-Lonsdale is a British-American writer with family roots in Hawaii and the Philippines. She holds a doctorate in education and has taught English literature in London, Oxford and Florence over the past decade. She studied creative writing and English in Los Angeles and New York and is an alumni of the Faber Academy. Her debut novel, The Portrait Artist, is out now and published by Bloomsbury, and here to chat all about it, welcome Dani to A Pair of Bookends.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to chat to you about your book. But before we get into that, I have to ask you my favourite question, which is, what are you currently reading?
It's a great question, isn't it? We're all readers. So I'm reading such a treat at the moment. I'm not very far in, I have to admit, because I kind of got distracted with all the book launch stuff in the past couple of weeks. Of course, yeah. I'm currently reading The Pretender by Jo Harkin, and it's a historical fiction. I believe it comes out in April, so next month, one to look for. And essentially, it's a book inspired by the real story of Lambert Simnel. Takes place during 1480, I think during the height of the War of the Roses. And it's about 12-year-old John, who grew up on a farm. So he's a farm boy, he spent his childhood there. And a stranger comes and essentially upends his life and tells him he's not really John, but is the rightful heir to the throne. And obviously it's quite a tempestuous time. So it's quite an exciting premise, I think, to see what happens to poor John. And so the book is essentially about him being whisked away from this family life that he's known and trained. I think he goes to Oxford first and then some other places. And he essentially trains to either become king or die trying. So I look forward to, now that things are starting to calm down a little bit more, to diving back in. It's just brilliant. It's witty. It's really sharp. I mean, I actually just opened the first page to have a little sneak peek, and then I couldn't stop reading because it's that compelling. And the writing it makes me laugh out loud sometimes. It's so funny, but then also incredibly intelligent.
Wow, this sounds great. And it's on my TBR, which rarely happens. I normally get authors, telling me about amazing books that they're reading. And I'm like, oh, I really need to get my hands on that. I must remember it. And then I've actually got it with me, so I can get to it. So that's really exciting. But let's get into you and your book. I love to start off the debut spotlight episodes by asking about debut author's journey into having their first novel published. Obviously, it's such an incredible whirlwind time, I'm sure, and you're very fresh.
Yes.
Fresh from launch week. So how has that been, and what has your journey been like?
Well, thanks for asking that. I'm kind of just now starting to float down from the cloud because, I had two lovely launches last week, one in London, one out in the Cotswolds, more local to where I live and where the book takes place. But my journey, I think, as all writers who eventually do publish books, like everyone else, I have always written. So even when I was really little, I was always writing stories. I think creative writing at school was always one of my favorite things to do. And I've always been a massive reader, of course. I think the two go hand in hand.
Sure.
And so eventually, like you said earlier in my bio, I studied English and creative writing in Los Angeles. I think once upon a time I thought I wanted to be a screenwriter, which is another form of storytelling, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I quickly realized I was more about, novel writing and wanting to write those types of stories in books. And so I kept writing. I moved to New York and I studied literary cultures there. Eventually, I took a pivot. I moved over to London to study social policy and development at the London School of Economics because I thought I wanted to get into education policy. And so I started writing on the side more. It wasn't my main focus. And then eventually got into teaching. So I'm also a teacher. I'm still teaching. I teach part-time and I write part-time now, which feels like the dream combination. But basically, with this particular book, it was a bit mad because at the time I started writing this book, I was head of English at a school. I was finishing my dissertation for my doctorate and I had my children. I gave birth to my children. So it was a really busy time that I started writing. And then I finished the book when my family were abroad for a year in Florence. And so I think it was a really appropriate place to finish writing this, obviously about art. I think being in that beautiful historical city with the Uffizi at my fingertips, I think it really influenced the final finishing touches whilst writing this particular book. So it's been an absolute whirlwind, like you say. We moved back from Florence after our stint abroad for the year. And I decided for the first time, because I had been teaching full time, I decided I was going to give writing a shot. So I would teach part-time and then devote, that extra time to writing to truly give it a go. We moved back at the end of the summer and my agent got in touch with me in September. So it was it was a good risk to kind of take because suddenly I did have that time to devote to editing the manuscript before we went out on submission.
That's incredible. And to think that you've been traveling in that time, you've had children. It's incredible that you've produced this book amongst all of that and amongst teaching as well. That's huge. Have you had any, I don't know what it's like for people that teach who are putting books out into the world. How is it in terms of, that conversation with your students? Are you kind of wanting them to read it? Are you not? Has any of them said anything yet? Have any of them got their hands on it yet? Like, what's that been like?
This is such an interesting question because obviously I don't know yet. This is new territory for me to be at the front of the room, guiding a discussion on literature and then knowing that my book is out there for anybody, not just my students and my colleagues, but for anyone in the world to read and to say anything about it, especially, with social media these days. So far, I mean, like you said, my book just came out a few days ago officially, but it's really sweet. Most of my students are so excited about it. They ask about it quite a lot, and they've been asking about the journey as well, which is really nice because some of them are interested in writing or in publishing. So it's been fun to share that journey because I think even I didn't know, all the details that go into publishing a book and how long it takes.
Yes.
And so a few of them I know are in the middle of reading it now. So I look forward to hearing what they think. And my colleagues as well. I was talking to a friend the other day who's not a teacher, and I said, actually, being in a faculty of other English teachers, they'll be my best critics, really.
Yeah,
they'll
for
know,
sure.
Comparing to the literature that we're teaching. But everyone's been super supportive and excited. So it's been really fun.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, you want that support and people checking in and seeing how you're doing. But yeah, I always imagine that it's quite scary when you're teaching people and you feel like, the power dynamics are sort of shifting a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. They can say anything they want about the matter.
But that's really exciting, and I'm so glad that you've had that support there, especially with your colleagues as well. But let's get into your book. Your novel is built around the art of Timothy Pondon Hall, who is a fictional artist, we should say. Where did your fascination with art begin?
So I have always loved art since I can remember. Even as a child, there was something, again, I think it's a different way of storytelling, isn't it? I think there are all these different forms of capturing something or a moment or a story. So I've always loved it, particularly drawn to color and texture. I love a really good textured piece of work. And I think in another world, I always say this, rather than studying English literature and writing, I would have done art history because I love it so much. And so that love for art has always been there. And then recently, I've been reading more books with art. And then I had the pleasure of teaching The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde at A level for several years. And I think that really sparked this idea about, how could we metaphorically, but also, maybe truly preserve someone or create immortality through art or a painting that exists forever. Mm-hmm. And obviously when you look at a painting or any work of art, you bring yourself with it. So no one sees any work of art the same as somebody else. I suppose it's like you bring yourself to a book as well, don't you? And so I think I wanted to explore that in a story, this idea of capturing people, immortalizing them, and also playing with rumor and gossip, around the work. And I think that's partly where Dorian Gray kind of influenced my writing.
How to have fun anytime, anywhere. Step 1, go to ChumbaCasino.com.
ChumbaCasino.com. Got it.
Step 2, collect your welcome bonus.
Come to Papa welcome bonus.
Step 3, play hundreds of casino-style games for free.
That's a lot of games, all for free?
Step 4, unleash your excitement.
Chumba Casino has been delivering thrills for over a decade. So claim your free welcome bonus now and live the Chumba life. Visit ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
That as well.
That's amazing. I am ashamed to admit that I haven't actually read that book, which is... I hate you when this happens.
No. I don't think you should be ashamed at all, because it just means, you can add that to your, I'm sure, which is a very long queue of your TBR pile, but it is great. It's one of the ones
a
I'll
book
recommend.
that I've always wanted to get to, but it's just one of those where it's because, obviously I do the podcast and I get sent so many books that are like just coming out. It means that they take up so much of my reading time, and then all of the classics that I really want to get to, they just kind of fall by the wayside, and I really hate it.
Oh no,
it makes me feel like I'm not well read.
No, not at all. No, I mean, how many books are in the world as
Honestly.
well, right? I think that's something I struggle with as well, just having to, reading for the book, rereading the books I'm teaching just to stay fresh, and then also wanting to read the new books that are coming out just to stay in those conversations, but then reading the hundreds of classics that are classics for a reason. I think it's a real struggle for everyone.
Yeah,
I think.
for sure. Now, obviously, we've spoken about your fascination with art and how that sort of started and how that's found its way into you wanting to write this book. But zooming in on specifically the artist in the book, Timothy Podden Hall, what is the inspiration for his art and him? I'd love to hear about that.
So his particular style of paintings, they are inspired by a real artist who I know today, who happens to be a great friend of our family's. She's called Emily Ponsonby, and I would recommend looking up her work because she's such a talented painter, and I think she gets better and better. So she has a really unique style of painting. She uses beeswax and oil, and a lot of the book, it kind of shows how textured and unique these paintings are, because basically the process is that the painter puts beeswax on board or canvas or whatever. They kind of slosh it on and they let it dry. And only after that do they put the paints on. And then as they paint, they start chiseling and chipping away at the beeswax while they're painting. So it becomes a much more textured and layered method of painting. And so it's gorgeous to look at, to even, you're so tempted to touch it, I think, when I see them, because you just want, it's so tactile and beautiful the way the textures build up on each other. Mm-hmm. And it just adds such dimension to any scene that's being kind of portrayed in the work. And so I found that it was really fun to write about that as well, because I think it's a risk, isn't it? It could be really dry writing about paintings or writing about other forms of art. And so I hope I've achieved that, just because I think that the process of painting, especially what Emily does and what I've tried to kind of mimic and borrow for Timothy Podden Hall, it is more than just putting a brush, to a canvas. There's so much more to it than that. So I had a lot of fun writing about that at the risk of, making something quite banal.
It's so interesting to read about as well, and I think it's so interesting to hear about an artist's process, because I tried to do art when I was younger in school, and I think there's something about how maybe intricate it is and how like delicate everything is, and I feel like I don't think it's necessarily that I get irritated. It's that like I don't know if I necessarily have the patience for it. It requires so much patience, doesn't it?
Yes.
And I don't know if I have that. And I think I would get so frustrated with myself for not being able to take the time and be so gentle and careful with it. And my boyfriend's a graphic designer, and he's very good with, you know, I've watched him drawing and doing various things like that and creating stuff on his computer. And he is just like, he really can take the time doing the really intricate details of things, and it just blows my mind. So it's so fascinating to read about it, and I wish it was a skill that I had, but for now I will have to settle with reading about it.
We can enjoy what other people are doing, I suppose.
Yeah.
I also think the timing thing is interesting because you're absolutely right. I think it takes patience and a lot of time to look at the detail. But I also think there's the span of time to achieve mastery, right? So, for example, if we look at any artwork now, even modern artists, and if anyone ever comments about, you know, the cost of a piece of work, you know, if it seems really expensive or something, we always have to remember that actually you're not actually paying just for those literal paints or wax on the canvas. You're paying for a time span, sometimes a lifespan of experiences and mastering the craft and getting better and finding what works and finding what doesn't work and experimentation. So that's what comes in the finished product, which is so interesting because we forget, you know, about everything, all the steps and the trials and the experiences that come before it.
100%, yeah. I went to the Lake District with my mum last week, I think it was, and we visited a couple of galleries, and my mum was looking at some of the paintings. She was like, oh, I'd really love to, you know, be able to buy this, and it's so expensive. And I was saying to her, no, like, it's about that artist's time, you know, it's about the time that's gone into it and all of that unpaid work. And, you know, you can put that into sort of any kind of medium of art. I remember when my friend, when her book, she got a publishing deal, and she was freaking out, and she was like, I've never seen this amount of money before. And I said, yes, but please think about the fact that how long you've spent writing unpaid.
Yes.
and actually that amount of money makes total sense.
Yeah.
And when you split it over a period of time, it's actually like not what you're worth, is it?
No, exactly. It's a funny thing, isn't it? This idea of value and what that means. And I think that's why the best art and artists who eventually get recognized, it's just not for the money, is it? It's because of a passion or a calling. You know, they feel they need to do these things. And I think that's really great. And I also think a lot of people say this, and I agree with them, you know, art isn't something that should be pretentious. It should be accessible for everybody. And there's no right or wrong way to feel about something or to access something. And so I think it's really exciting when people are touched in some way by any form of art.
Absolutely. I want to talk about setting, because your book is set between London and Oxford, but it is, you know, it's Victorian society. And I always love reading. I mean, I did actually say to you before that I'm not great with historical fiction, but I do find it fascinating reading about Victorians. The thing that I loved in this book is how much of a sensory reading experience it was. It was very visual, and you really got an idea of the visuals and the taste and the smells that these characters were experiencing as they're moving through the streets. But yeah, I loved immersing myself in the world of this book. And I wanted to know, was there a lot of research done in terms of those elements for you to portray this so well?
Thank you. That's kind of you to say. I mean, you could probably tell. So the art is there, but the other descriptions revolve around the setting and food.
Yes.
And I think food is a great way of bringing someone in because you can use all of the senses there. And so, you know, going hand in hand with some of the settings like the Oxford Covered Market, for example. So I live in the Cotswolds just outside of Oxford. So in terms of my research, you know, I literally would just be in Oxford a lot. I wrote much of the book in Oxford and dotted around the cafes there, and would just kind of wander and meander. And so, you know, going into the Covered Market, which did exist at the time, some of the smells, and I can imagine, you know, the coffee that would have been brewing in the air there, and, you know, the fish stalls, you know, and that sound of the scraping of the scales over ice and with the knives. things like that, I think they really stuck with me. And then I could really easily tie those to how I think it would have been, back then in 1890 when the book took place. Yes. It was also really fun in terms of the research to learn some of the superstitions. For example, Christmas pudding. There's a certain day you're supposed to make it and you stir it a certain way for a certain amount of times. And so it was fun to read these things just to see how food at the time period and food we even eat now still, right? But they were made in a certain way just to be traditional, I suppose.
I love reading about food. It's one of my favourite subjects. And there's actually a really brilliant moment in the book that has really stayed with me that I wanted to ask about, which is when Alice and Lou, two of your characters, are in this sweet shop and Lou is making this huge order and the shop assistant drops a ton of the sweets. And, Lou is like, it's fine, like, don't worry, we still want them. But the owner is incredibly vile to the shop assistant. He's shouting and just being awful. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about that moment in the book and what inspired it?
Yes. So this is actually my editor's favourite scene as well.
Oh,
We've spent a lot of time talking about this. I think there's something about the sumptuousness of fudge and boiled sweets in glass jars. There's something really romantic about these old sweet shops, aren't they? And chocolate limes, which, by the way, sound more romantic, I think, than they are.
Have you tried them?
Yes, I have. And they're not bad. I feel bad because I feel like I'm giving them a bad rap, but they're just boiled sweets. But I think when you hear chocolate lime, you almost picture a crystallized candied lime dipped in chocolate or something.
Yes, that's what I was imagining.
And actually, they're simple boiled sweet and they're very sour. And actually, we had them at one of the launch parties.
Oh, wow.
Last week, and people love them. So they're not bad. They're just not, I think.
I'll still try them.
Yeah, what some people think they are. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the food.
I love this.
The sweet shop scene. So that for me was
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
It was, I suppose, one of the first obvious moments where the theme of race comes into the book.
Yes.
So this doesn't give anything away. So basically, Lou and Alice go into the sweet shop and they're ordering this massive order because Lou wants to give it as a gift. And the boxes are piling up on the counter in a very hyperbolic way, I suppose. It's even drawing a crowd, so people are starting to stop walking around and they're watching this happen because it's almost like a spectacle now. They're buying so many sweets. And this boy who also has a limp and he is Malay, so he's not white. He is being treated quite badly by the shop owner, and then I think he trips and all of the boxes of fudge tumble over. And so it's a really dramatic scene because Lou and Alice, obviously, they see there's no harm done. It has damaged, the damage hasn't been done to the sweets or the fudge. And so everything's fine and they just want to help the boy up and dust him off. Whereas the shopkeeper absolutely unleashes on him and berates him in front of everybody to the point where Lou, very calm and collectedly, she says, "We will be taking our business elsewhere." And for me, that was an important point because up until then, there are some hints about, race and the truths that there were non-white people living at this time in London and in Oxford, but we just don't know about them. And so they're very quiet individuals, quiet identities living in the margins of society. And this is the first time where we see someone of colour thrown into the spotlight, and it's for a negative experience. It's because, he's being scolded and shouted at for making a mistake. And what I hope readers kind of take away is that, he would not have been treated that way if not for his skin color. And I think that's implied by the conversation that follows in the carriage between Lou and Alice. So I'm thrilled that you like it because it was a great scene for me to write, but I do think it's an important one as well because I think it's the first time that you think, oh, there is something there perhaps because that theme is throughout the book, even though it's quiet.
It's such an important scene, and I think it struck a chord with me because I've spent so much of my life working in hospitality and working in in restaurants and things, there always seems to be, you know, a power dynamic, but it's usually the power dynamic is between the customer and the server.
Yes.
But in this, it was, you know, it was very much that the shopkeeper could have actually helped him at any time. Like, let's
Absolutely.
just make that clear.
Yes, yes.
Chose
And
to let
instead
this boy struggle.
Yes, and he was just tallying how many, you know, how much they ordered, really.
Yes, yeah. He was so greedy, and I think that's what really drew me in. It felt very much like it was exploring greed and class, which really interested me. But you're right, it's so much about race as well, and that does crop up a lot in the book. And I would love to talk about that, because there is another moment in the book where Alice and Lou are discussing. I think this character is older than them, and the character's called Mary, and Mary manages the estate, and this is the first time that Alice is told by Lou that Mary has managed this estate, and she's quite shocked by this. And you wrote, "At this, Alice is baffled, for she's never known a woman of colour to be held in such esteem as to run a house." And I was curious, you know, what was important to you when writing about race in the book? Obviously, we just spoke about it in terms of the sweet shop scene, but I was curious, you know, in terms of that and how you wanted to portray race in this period of time.
That's a lovely question. Thank you. So I think for me, the importance of diverse representation in the novel was really at the forefront of my mind while I was writing it, particularly in historical fiction, right?
Yes.
Because, like I said earlier, people of colour, they did exist, they did live at the same time, but they were never the protagonists in books, and they were never, you know, the main characters. But they were around, they did exist, you know, and my research showed there are certain neighbourhoods where they lived, and I think there are probably stereotypes that come with that. There are even some paintings in existence that depict people of colour, and they're not very well known, of course, but it just shows that they were there, you know, living in this time that's quite famous, particularly in literature. Now, what I was really careful about doing was I'm not trying to, you know, rewrite history, right? I'm not trying to claim that these people were more important than they were, because that wouldn't be realistic, and that's not my goal at all. But what I am trying to do is shine a light just to show these people were there, and actually they had really valuable and important experiences. And obviously my book is fiction, and so I had the liberty, I suppose, of, you know, creating these stories that were taking place in the margins of society. But I think that's the beauty of fiction. We get to explore ideas and shine a light on something that hasn't been the main focus before. And so that was really important to me. And I think the way I'll talk about this, because obviously I don't want to give anything away.
Yes, be careful.
Which is really tricky, actually. Race is an important theme in this book. And there are lots of hidden truths that I've interwoven throughout the story from the beginning, from the first page, actually. And you might not know about it. And I think partly that's the point, is that they are hidden truths, even though they're working there behind the scenes. Yeah. And I think the hope is that as you discover one hidden truth and you kind of pick at something, it's like unraveling, you know, the rest of the story. And I think it's important to say these hidden truths, they're there by necessity. They're hidden by necessity and not for a plot device.
Yeah, I think what I really loved about the way that you wrote about race in this book, and I think we are seeing a rise in recent years in diverse representation being seen more and more in historical fiction. And like you said, it's really important because so many of the history books have tried to, you know, hide people, and it's just been, I mean, the history that I was taught in school felt very white. And that's not actually the case, you know. These people haven't just sprung out of nowhere. Like, I don't, it's baffling, but, you know, it's the way society was. And I think you found this really great balance between honesty of their experiences historically, whilst also sort of allowing them to exist in a way that society perhaps wouldn't have at the time. So I think that's, you know, a really clever way of playing with historical fiction, is that you're staying as truthful as you can, whilst also showing that actually, no, these people existed, and whilst they may not be represented in the history books, they were there.
Yes, exactly. And that's all I'm trying to do, because I think, you know, I'm not trying to be overly bold here. I'm not making
not at all.
Grand claims, you know, and I think that's, so thank you for recognizing that, because it really is just about saying, look, just be more aware. widen your lens and just be aware of the lives. There were many different ways to live at that time. And even if, like you said, the history books didn't capture them, they were still important and in existence.
Absolutely. Now, you did just mention hidden truths in the book, and I will tread as carefully as I can here. But I want to ask about the sort of plot twists and reveals in the book by keeping it spoiler free. So we're going to navigate that together.
Yeah. This is good. I'm
interested
to see how you do it. I'm going to learn from this for future talks.
But there are reveals in the book, and there are, like you said, these hidden truths. And I would just love to ask how you go about plotting these things and how you kind of, sow the seeds. I don't know how else to ask this. It's difficult without giving any reveals.
I know, exactly. Yeah, no, it's tricky. The short answer to that is I knew the main truth that I wanted to reveal, and I worked backwards. And so I think it was, there's a prominent character who I found very interesting when I was creating them. And so working backwards to lay some hints and some truths. And like I said, I think when you start to recognize one, it leads to the next, and it leads to the next, and it leads to the next. Now, I will say, and I find this interesting, I think we're in what I would call twist culture. I think people love a good twist or a really big reveal. And I would argue that my book isn't really a twist book, if that makes sense. Yeah. Although I think some people might approach it that way. And if they do, they might be a bit disappointed, because I don't think it's a massive reveal, but I do think it's I hadn't thought of it that way before, and that's my hope. And then, dare I say this, and I'd be interested to know what you think, but when one of the bigger reveals is revealed, by the end, there's even another one, which is less definitive, I suppose. It's so funny to talk about this in such obscure terms.
Yeah, I know.
Without giving it away.
The listeners are getting very annoyed, I can imagine. But I think it's when the reveal that I think is the biggest happens, I think I kind of had a moment where I was like, oh, this makes complete sense. Yeah. This makes absolute sense. Like, I really had the moment where I was like, this doesn't feel, it is shocking, but also, okay, no, this does make sense. Like, this was there all along.
Earth-shattering, is it? It's not some big, because it's not that type of book, I think, which I think is a good thing, because I think more than anything, I would like people to think back and say, oh, there were breadcrumbs that kind of led to this. And actually, it makes sense now, the details in the book that I've kind of focused on in the lead up.
Yes. We'll have to move away from this subject now, because it's very dangerous territory.
It is, isn't it?
I always do this. I always go from laughing and then wanting to talk about a serious subject. So I'm sorry to the listeners, but I am going to talk about grief.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know how it always seems to happen in an episode. I'll be laughing and then I'll be like, right, we're talking about grief now. But if you don't laugh, you'll cry, so it's fine. But yeah, I want to talk about grief because I thought you explored it so beautifully in the book. And again, I don't know how much of this I can give away, but it does impact Alice and her father's life in a way that, it shapes the way that they live their life and their relationship. And I suppose the way they interact with other people as well. And I think that's quite safe to say. Could you tell us about the effects of grief on your characters and why you wanted to write about it?
Yes. So I think the father-daughter relationship dynamic in this book was a really important one, obviously. So, I mean, in a nutshell, very quickly, they both lose, someone in their family. So, for example, Solomon Oak, who's the art historian, he's, I suppose, one of the main characters, of course. He has a daughter, Alice, who is also a main character. And he used to have another daughter who obviously died, so Emma. And so Alice is grieving her older sister. And I think it's important that she's an older sister because this makes it even more complicated in many ways, which I'll go into in a second. But then obviously you have Oak, who's grieving his oldest daughter, who I think he was closer to just naturally in terms of temperament, than his younger daughter. And so I think, Emma died 10 years before this story takes place, and Solomon Oak is still wallowing in it. He hasn't pulled himself out of it. And his response has been to shut himself away from the world, which is why he's not really a working art historian anymore. So when this Timothy Pondon Hall painting appears and he's pulled back in, it's a lifeline for him actually to come back into the world and actually to look to his side and recognize he still has a living daughter, you know, that he's almost stalled developing that relationship. And I think she has as well, even though she wants it a bit more than he does, because they're almost too afraid to care too much about the other one, you know, for fear of experiencing that loss again. So I think there's a really heartbreaking dynamic between them because they live under the same roof, but they are almost preserving themselves from feeling too much. So when this painting comes and their world is kind of turned upside down and they have to engage with the wider world again, I think it's probably a good thing. But I think grief is still being dealt with, you know,
Yes.
and I think there are many things there. For example, Alice, she's the living daughter, and so she's grieving her sister. She misses her. She wonders, you know, often in the book how the relationship might be like if she was still alive. And there's guilt there as she makes friends with other women like Grace Dodd, who's, you know, another key character in the book here. And so I think it's this balance of moving on and embracing life and being excited about life, particularly for Alice, who's young and has this thirst to travel and, you know, explore whilst remembering her sister. Now, one of the reasons I'm so interested is because I was really influenced when I was younger by reading the biography of J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. And so I don't know if you know, do you know the origins of Peter Pan? Like how that story came about?
I have seen Finding Neverland, the show, and I believe that is around the story of Peter Pan and what inspired it. So
yes,
I think
absolutely.
so.
Yeah. And so Peter Pan's been one of my favorite stories since I was a child. The original Peter Pan, though, you know, not the Disney-fied version.
Yes.
And so I went down a rabbit hole when I was quite young and just started reading all about J.M. Barrie, who wrote it, because it started out as a play. And so I was reading a lot about him and how this idea of this boy who never grew up, you know, came to him. And essentially, J.M. Barrie had an older brother, David, who died in a tragic accident when he was a boy. And their mother never got over it. And so she was always wishing that David was still alive. And Barrie always lived in that shadow. And I remember reading a line in his biography where he said, it's really strange that I have surpassed your age now. So he's now older than his older brother, who should always be older than him. And that really stuck with me for whatever reason. It has obviously materialized in this book, you know, this idea of outliving a once beloved sibling who should be older than you, and yet they are immortalized forever at that young age.
Oh God, that's so touching, isn't it?
It's really powerful. And I think that's probably why it impacted me when I was really young. It's quite a heavy idea to grapple with when you're little.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I think if you have siblings, you really understand how powerful like that dynamic is. So yeah, that's so sad. I don't think I'd heard that story before. So thank you for telling me that. But there's actually a really touching moment in the book, and I'm not gonna. I feel like I've kind of given enough from certain moments in the book. I don't want to give away too much, but there is a lovely conversation between father and daughter, and it feels like there's been some distance between the two of them since her sister's died and since his daughter's died. It feels like there's been this huge hole in the family home, and you know, maybe that's physically they've been close, but you know, mentally they're very distant, and they have this conversation, and it feels like the first time that they've maybe had a conversation after she's passed. And you know, I don't know, it just opens up something new, doesn't it? And it's, you know, a willingness to kind of move forward in some way, while still acknowledging that, you know, this grief is such a difficult thing, and you know, this loss is so huge and it'll always be present, but we can move forward. You know, it's that kind of acknowledgement of it. And I thought that conversation was a really beautiful moment in the book. I said I wasn't going to say anything about it, and here I am.
No, thank you. I mean, again, that is a really important theme, and it's an important relationship, isn't it?
Yes.
I think that relationship had to have an arc, because I think we start off, you know, in a really, they're very secluded because they've kind of, well, Solomon Oak has anyway, whereas Alice is, you know, tearing her out, trying to escape into the world. But I think that particular moment as well, it's kind of opening themselves up to vulnerability,
absolutely,
to the world and what could happen to them, but also to each other, to say, actually, we can develop this relationship at the risk of losing it, but what wonderful thing isn't without risk? And I think it's them acknowledging that.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, I've loved chatting to you about this book, and there's so many beautiful moments. And I could speak about more, but it would be it's risky for spoiler territory. So listeners, please go and buy yourselves a copy of this book. It is out now and published by Bloomsbury. And then come and slide into our DMs so that we can chat about all of the spoilers.
Absolutely, yes. We can talk more freely.
Absolutely. Dani, thank you so much for coming on today and chatting to me about your book. Before I let you go, I do have to ask for a recommendation, which is another one of my favourite things to ask for. As I told you before, it can be anything from books, art, TV, film, anything goes for this one.
Wonderful. Well, thank you as well for having me, by the way, because this has been really fun. What a wonderful way to start the morning. I will leave you with 2 recommendations.
Oh, love this.
The first one, I will link to the art. So I mentioned her before. Emily Ponsonby is the artist. She has a wonderful, beautiful Instagram account where you could kind of dip into her work, and then she has a website as well.
Great.
So like I said, she's the artist who painted beeswax and oils, and she influenced the style of paintings in this book. So I highly recommend you going there, because she is a marvel, and her artwork they're wonderful. And they inspire awe. And the last thing I will say is I would encourage everybody to read the original story of Peter Pan by Jane Barrie, just because it is darker and it's grittier than a lot of the more famous versions of the story. So it came out first as a book called Peter and Wendy in 1911. It actually started out as a play in 1904. So I think technically you could even find the published version of the play, but I think the 1911 Peter and Wendy is definitely the story to read.
Oh my goodness. I'm so happy that you've recommended that, because I think I've definitely, with Peter Pan, only seen the Disney-fied version, and I've not read the book. But like I said, I watched Finding Neverland. That was when I went to New York. I went to go and see that, and that kind of gave me a whole new perspective on the story. But I think, there's definitely further to go with that in terms of, seeing the history of that story. And I always love that. I love when you can get into a little rabbit hole of one piece of culture. So I'm really excited to go and read that book. Thank you.
Of course. It's so easy to spiral, isn't it, when you find something 100%. Compelling, and just to keep
it's dangerous, but I love it.
It is.
Oh, Dani, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much for this book as well.
Of course. Thank you so much for reading and for having me on.
And where can my listeners find you on social media?
Instagram is my main account.
Amazing.
So it's an easy handle. It's just Dani Heywood-Lonsdale.
Perfect. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on X. I hate saying X. On X and TikTok. And go give Dani a follow. Go buy her amazing book. And we will see you very soon. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.